that risk is what you don't see. And just like the first story, this has nothing to do with investing. A story about Harry Houdini, the famous magician that did most of his work about 100 years ago. And Houdini, of course, was famous for his escapes. You would tie him up in chains, put him in a straitjacket, throw him in the East River, bury him under sand. He would find his way out. He would unlatch himself and dig his way out. This is what he became famous for. But Harry Houdini actually had another stunt that he did during every show that crowds loved. He wasn't that famous for it, but it was one of the crowd's favorite stunts that he would perform. What he would do at the end of every show is Harry Houdini would invite the largest, most muscular man onto stage, and he would tell that man to punch him in the stomach as hard as he could. Harry Houdini would flex his solar plexus and say, punch me as hard as you can, give it everything you've got, I can stand it. Harry Houdini was an amateur boxer, and his claim to fame was that he could flex his solar plexus in a way that could withstand any man's punches. So he would just let men beat him up on stage and he was fine. One day in 1922, after a show in Canada, Harry Houdini went back to his dressing room and he invited a group of students back to meet him. One of the students was a guy named Robert Whitehead. And Robert Whitehead walked up to Harry Houdini and started hitting him in the stomach as hard as he could. He didn't mean any harm. He thought he was just performing the trick, the stunt that he had just witnessed on stage. But Harry Houdini was not prepared for these punches. He was not flexing his solar plexus. He fell to the ground. He waved Robert Whitehead off and said, "What are you doing? I'm not prepared to be punched." Robert Whitehead felt terrible. He said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Houdini. I thought I was just performing the same trick. I didn't mean to cause you any harm." But Harry Houdini woke up the next morning, doubled over in pain. His appendix had ruptured, almost certainly from Robert Whitehead's punches. And Harry Houdini died that day. That was how Harry Houdini died. And what's so fascinating to me about this is this. Harry Houdini could survive seemingly anything. Put him in a straitjacket and throw him in the East River. He could do that no problem. He did that on a daily basis for his shows. Bury him in sand, under 6 feet of sand, he could dig himself out, no problem, because he was prepared for those things. He knew he had a plan for it. He knew they were coming. He could prepare himself. If he was prepared, he could survive anything. But the one thing that he was not prepared for, getting jabbed in the stomach by a college student, since he was not prepared for it, literally killed him. And I think this is actually true in a lot of fields, that how risky something is depends on whether you're prepared for it. Not how big the event is, not how traumatic it looks, just whether you are prepared for it. And that is also true in the economy. It's also true for investing. The biggest economic risk is what no one is talking about. Because if no one is talking about it, no one is prepared for it. And if no one is prepared for it, its damage will be amplified when it arrives. This has been true, but this has been especially important and relevant this year in 2020, because we spent the last 10 years in the economics profession, in the investing profession, debating, writing about, talking about what was the biggest risk to the economy. And we tend to personify these risks. We say, who is the risk to the economy? So for the last 10 years, we debated, was the biggest risk to the economy this guy? Was it Barack Obama? Was it the stimulus packages, the tax hikes of 2013? Was he the biggest risk to the economy? Was it this guy? Was it Ben Bernanke? Was it all the stimulus that came after the financial crisis, the money printing? Was he the biggest risk? Was it this guy? Was it Donald Trump? Was it trade wars? Was it the policies? Was he the biggest risk to the economy? And we know in hindsight that the answer was no. None of these three guys was the biggest risk to the economy. The biggest risk by far was this guy. It was a virus that no one was talking about, was not in the headlines, was not in any major newspapers until it happened. The biggest risk by far, by an order of magnitude, was the thing that no one was talking about until it happened. And I think if you look historically at the economy and the stock market, this story is always the case, that what people are talking about, the risks that they're talking about, are never actually the biggest risks in hindsight. You know, if you look at the risks that people talk about, it's things like trade wars, next quarter's earnings, budget deficit forecasts, elections. Those are the risks that are in the newspapers that people talk about. And it's not that these things aren't risky. It's that people know about them. They're aware of them. So both financially and psychologically, they're prepared for them when they arrive. But if you look historically at what is actually the biggest risk that moves the needle the most, it's things like COVID-19. Like Lehman Brothers couldn't find a buyer in 2008 that started the financial crisis. September 11th, Pearl Harbor. Those are the biggest risks that actually move the needle. And the common denominator of these is that no one was talking about them until they happened. And I think, this can kind of be disheartening for people to learn that the biggest risk is always what no one's talking about, because it kind of makes you feel vulnerable. It makes you feel like you're kind of a fatalist, just saying, how do I think about risk if the biggest risk is what I'm not thinking about at this given moment? And I think there's two ways to help yourself in this situation to try to get more comfortable with the idea that risk is what you don't see. One is to think about risk in the economy and investing the same way that California thinks about earthquakes. What I mean by that is having expectations versus forecasts. Because look, if you live in California, you know with 100% certainty that earthquakes will be part of your future. Big, dangerous, risky earthquakes will be part of your future. But you don't know when they're going to occur. You can't forecast when the next earthquake is going to happen. You don't know where it's going to happen. You don't know necessarily how big it's going to be. So rather than trying to forecast the next earthquake, people in California are just prepared for them to occur at any given moment. Firefighters and EMS crews are prepared at any given moment. There's no earthquake pundits. There's no earthquake forecast. You just prepare that at any given moment it might arrive, and someday it eventually will. I think thinking about economic risk and investing risk the same way is really important. Look, if I were to say, hypothetically, the next recession will occur in Q3 of 2022, I'm just making that up. That's a forecast. And I think that's kind of dangerous. If I were to say instead that historically there have been 2 recessions per decade on average, and we should expect that going forward. I don't know when they're going to occur. I don't know what's going to trigger them, but my asset allocation and my psychology is prepared for at least 2 recessions per decade as my baseline assumption. I think that's a much healthier way to think about risk. The other thing to think about here is the idea of getting rich versus staying rich, 2 very different skills that need to be nurtured on their own. Getting rich requires being an optimist, swinging for the fences, taking a risk. That's what you need to get rich. Staying rich is almost the opposite. Staying rich requires a little bit of paranoia that you don't know what's going to happen next, that the future is going to be risky, that there's going to be setbacks and disappointments, recessions, bear markets, pandemics that you need to be prepared for with cash and of debt. These are conflicting skills, but I think everyone needs both of them and needs to be able to nurture them separately to do well at investing over time. So that's the second story.